Boston, 1854. The streets boiled with tension. The country was divided between southern slave states and north, free states. And it was in this scenario that the story of Anthony Burns became a scream of resistance. Anthony, an enslaved man, fled Virginia in search of freedom. He found refuge in Boston, one of the most active abolitionist centers of the time. But the cruel law of the fugitive slave, which even forced the free states to return slaves to their masters, did not forgive. Reported, Anthony was captured and taken to trial. When his arrest became public, thousands of people took to the streets. Violent protests, confrontations with the authorities, and even deaths happened. Boston, the city of freedom, was on fire because of a man, Anthony Burns. The struggle for its freedom became a national symbol, revealing to the world that slavery was not just a Southern issue, but an open wound across the country. Before you board this story that burned Boston in 1854, tell me, where are you watching? This fight happened in the United States, but talks about freedom and justice anywhere in the world. For you, was Anthony Burns just a victim of the law, or a hero who exposed the cruelty of slavery? Subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion in the comments. Boston's icy winds cut the narrow streets like invisible blades, bringing with it the palpable tension that hovered over the city. It was 1854, and the Fugitive Slave Law became an oppressive shadow that stretched throughout the country. That legislation, imposed by the federal government, intended to restore order in a nation divided by slavery, but in practice, it became a hunting tool for men and women who dared to dream of freedom. The sound of boots hitting the floor echoed by the alleys, a constant reminder that at any time, a reward hunter could come from the shadows, armed with a mandate that gave him the right to drag anyone back to the captivity. Anthony Burns, a striking man, felt like a cornered animal. His always attentive eyes were constantly sweeping the environment around him. He knew he couldn't trust anyone, for any stranger could be the hand that would take him back to hell from which he had run away. The city of Boston, known for his abolitionist fervor, was a tensions cauldron. The population was divided. On the one hand, the activists who secretly helped the fugitives hide or to go to the North for freedom in Canada. On the other hand, those who, for money or conviction, saw in the fugitive slave law an opportunity for profit and control. Among them were men like Thomas Jackson, a cold and calculating reward hunter, who saw in Anthony not just a prey, but a personal challenge. Jackson, with his reputation never to fail, was feared even by his own colleagues. His presence in Boston was like a warning cry for all fugitives. The impact of the law was felt at every corner, each alley. Suggested conversations in taverns and secret meetings in muffled attic became the only relief for those who lived under constant threat. Anthony, whose courage was admired by many, had become a symbol of resistance. Their stories of escape and survival inspired hope, but they also attracted unwanted attention. He knew that his capture would be used as an example, a warning to others who dare to challenge the established order. The legally solid legislation was morally questionable, and it eroded society from the inside out. Families were torn, while men and women who had built their lives in freedom were torn from their communities. Anthony was aware that the fight was unequal. The law allowed any white man to claim possession over a black man without the need for blunt evidence. It was enough for the word of each other, and in court, the balance of justice hung dangerously in favor of oppressors. The streets of Boston, illuminated by shaking lamps, looked like a stage of conspiracies. The nights were populated by whispers of escape and resistance plans. Anthony was often in the company of brave-heart abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, who risked everything to fight that infamous law. They saw in Anthony not only a man to be saved, but a symbol of a larger cause, a flame of hope to be kept on. The psychological tension was overwhelming. Anthony lived every day as if it were the last, a constant state of warning that led him to the limit. When the sun was put, he knew that the darkness brought with it not only tranquility, but also the danger. Reward hunters like Jackson were relentless, driven by a determination that knew no limits. The price about your head. It was a temptation that few could resist. However, even in the face of such adversity, Anthony refused to give in. There was something inside him, a spark of hope that refused to erase. Each day in freedom, each step in Southern direction was a small victory against a system that insisted on turning it into property. He knew that his time in Boston could be running out, but until the moment of truth came, Anthony would fight with all his strength, challenging the law of the fugitive slave to every beat of his heart. And so, in the midst of an ocean of injustice, Anthony Burns remained as an unshakable rock, determined to write his own history of freedom. Anthony Burns's breathing echoed in his mind like an incessant drum. Each inspiration brought out the heavy aroma of the streets of Boston, a mixture of burnt charcoal, distant sea air, and the unbearable metal smell of fear. In his dreams, he still felt his hands as the Virginia Capataz, a calloused fingers that left invisible marks on his soul, even now, when time and distance should have erased them. That night when he decided to escape the plantation in Virginia, the full moon illuminated the way as if the heavens themselves were in his favor. Anthony felt his heart throb in his chest with a force that almost made him stop. The sound of crickets and breeze between the leaves was the only witnesses of their silent race for freedom. But it was not just the spirit of survival that propelled him. The memory of his parents, torn from his side and sold as goods, was a constant reminder of the cruelty he left behind. He had promised himself that he would never fall into the servitude trap again. The crossing to the north was not without its horrors. For days, hunger and cold were their constant companions. In a moment of despair, he remembered that he found a dead deer, probably hunted by some fiercer predator than him. Without hesitation, he used his hands to tear pieces of raw meat, the salty and metallic taste filling his mouth as the blood dripped down his arms. This brutality was the price of your freedom, a price that would pay times without account if necessary. Finally, by crossing the border for freedom, Anthony arrived in Boston. The city was a maze of unknown sounds and smells, who danced around it with almost tangible energy. Here he expected to find refuge, a place where he could live without the constant fear of being hunted like an animal. But the invisible presence of men like Thomas Jackson, who hovered over him like a black cloud, was a reminder that the fight was far from over. The first days in Boston were a mixture of relief and terror. Anthony found shelter in a small abolitionist community. They gave him a new name, new documents, and with that, a new identity. But even among allies, he remained restless. The nights were haunted by chains and whips, and the days sighs of hope and whispers of conspiracies. One afternoon, as he walked the streets of cobblestone, Anthony crossed Sarah Turner, a woman with bright eyes and fierce determination. She was one of the leaders of the local abolitionist movement, and, by crossing her gaze with Anthony, recognized in him the flame of resistance she admired so much. Sarah introduced him to a group that met secretly in a damp basement on the outskirts of the city. There, under the hesitance of candles, plans were drawn, promises were made, and a brotherhood of resistance strengthened. Anthony quickly became a central figure in that small army of freedom. His escape story inspired others to believe that change was possible. But joy was always seasoned by the cruel reality that unfolded around them. Each day, more men and women were dragged back south, and with every unsuccessful rescue, the danger increased to everyone. One night, while church bells echoed in the distance, Anthony heard a murmur in the air, a subtle warning that something was about to happen. He and Sarah were warned that a police beat was being planned for that same night, aiming to capture abolitionists and fugitives in a single devastating blow. With his heart fired, Anthony and his new family of resistance went into action. They moved as shadows through the streets of Boston, alerting other members and helping fugitives hide in dark only in secret passages. The tension was palpable, and each movement seemed careful dance between life and death. While the city's clock marked midnight, Anthony met alone in an alley, breathing forming clouds of steam in the cold air. In this moment of loneliness, he felt the weight of his choices. Freedom was a constant struggle, and with every step taken, he knew that the risk increases I was. But it was a risk that was willing to run, for even if her freedom was as fragile as the glass, she was yours. And with this thought, Anthony Burns decided that he would continue to fight, not only for himself, but for all those who were still chained by slavery. That night, while the first rays of sunshine began to illuminate the city, Anthony knew his journey was far from over. But with each firm step on the streets of Boston, he remembered his promise to move on, always toward the light of freedom. The city of Boston woke up under a gray sky, heavy as lead. The streets, usually animated with the buzz of merchants and the hasty rhythm of passers-by, seemed quieter today, as if they were present the storm about to collapse. The smell of imminent rain mingled with the odor of burnt coal while the clouds accumulated, forming a threatening cloak over the city. Anthony Burns, with his eyes attentive and his posture always worn, felt the invisible weight of the threats around him. He walked through the alleys, trying to stay invisible between the shadows, but the feeling of being observed never abandoned him. The news of the planned police ranking the night before still echoed in his mind, a reminder of the fragility of his freedom. But something else was in the air that morning. Something that seemed to whisper warnings with the cold wind that cut his skin. It was during one of these walks that fate, cruel and inexorable, decided to manifest. A known figure, A traitor hidden under the facade of a friend had whispered his name in the wrong ears. Thomas Jackson, the reward hunter who had become the ghost of his nightmares, was now closer than ever. Jackson, with his predator eyes, had finally found Anthony's trail and would not rest until he captured him. The capture occurred in a narrow alley where the sound of Anthony's footsteps mingled with the drip of water from the gutters. In an instant, Jackson and his men emerged from the shadows, surrounding him with the accuracy of hungry wolves. Anthony, despite his fierce determination, knew he was at a disadvantage. The metallic smell of fear became almost palpable, and the sound of the chain being dragged on the floor was a cruel blow to his ears. Anthony fought. Every fiber of his being resisted the idea of being chained again. The sensation of cold steel against his skin was a revived nightmare, but he did not surrender without a fight. His screams of protest echoed through the brick walls, mingling with the sound of the whips trying to silence him. But despite his desperate resistance, Anthony was subdued, his arms trapped by shackles that seemed to weigh tons. The news of his capture spread through Boston as a fire in a dry forest. Anthony Burns's name became a war of war among the abolitionists, lighting a flame of revolt that could not be easily erased. The city, already divided, was launched in a whirlwind of emotions. The smell of gunpowder and betrayal hovered in the air, while men and women gathered to discuss the next steps. Sarah Turner, with her unshakable determination, led the clandestine meetings, her clear and resolute voice echoing in the hearts of those who were willing to fight. "We can't let Anthony be brought back to slavery," she exclaimed, her fiery look of passion and anger. Anthony's capture was more than an attack on a man. It was an affront to everyone who believed in human dignity and fundamental freedom. As Anthony awaited his destiny in a cold cell, the city was preparing for a battle that was not just physical, but moral. The streets of Boston became the stage of fervent protests, where men and women of all ages raised their voices in unison, demanding justice. The sound of firm steps echoed like thunder against the walls of the buildings, and the windows trembled with the cry for freedom. Inside his cell, Anthony felt the strength of the support that came from outside. His thoughts were a mixture of hope and despair as he remembered the promises he had made himself when he had escaped Virginia. Every scream that came to his ears was a reminder that he was not alone, that his fight was also the struggle of many. At that moment, Anthony's eyes, though tired, shone with a renewed determination. He knew that his capture was only the beginning of a larger battle, a battle that would transcend his own freedom and become a cry of resistance against oppression. The city of Boston, with its old streets and resistance stories, was ready to face the challenge. And so, while the night fell over the city, bringing with him the promise of a storm, Anthony Burns remained firm. His shackles were not only a symbol of his capture, but also a reminder of what Ava at stake. He knew that, even incarcerated, it was part of something larger, a flame of hope that could burden the world. And with this thought, Anthony prepared for what was to come, determined to fight to the last sigh for his freedom and for those who still dreamed of a free future. The city of Boston was on the edge of the collapse. The atmosphere was electrifying, loaded with tension and expectation. The gray sky seemed to be an omen that something monumental was about to happen. The news about the capture of Anthony Burns quickly transcended Boston's borders, echoing across the country. Anthony's name has become a symbol of resistance against oppression, and its capture, a catalyst for a lift that no one could predict. The city streets, usually full of everyday activities, became a battlefield where the deafening noise of firm steps and protest shouts reverberated by the brick walls. Men and women of all the spheres of life have gathered, united by a common goal, to demand the liberation of Anthony Burns. They were moved by a deep feeling of injustice, a passion that burned like an uncontrollable flame in their hearts. Protesters, many of whom had never met before, formed a pulsating mass of humanity and indignation. The sound of makeshift drums echoed the streets, following the voices that sang hymns of freedom and justice. The abolitionist flags fluttered in the wind, while slogans were proclaimed with fervor. "Free Anthony Burns!" It was the cry that united the crowd, a mantra that reverberated on the walls of the buildings, as if the city itself cries for justice. The authorities, taken by surprise by the magnitude of the protest, reacted hard. Soldiers and police were positioned at strategic points, their intimidating presences adding to the growing tension. The sound of horsepower and the dial of swords created a sinister soundtrack, a constant reminder that freedom had a high price. But the people of Boston would not retreat. They were willing to face any obstacle to ensuring that Anthony Burns was not taken back to the hell of slavery. Between the crowd, Sarah Turner emerged as a fearless leader. His voice, clear and decided, led the songs and coordinated the actions. "We can't let ourselves be intimidated," she shouted, her presence inspiring those around her. She carried with her the courage of those who knew the value of freedom, and her example was a flame that lit the determination of those by her side. The tension reached its peak when protesters arrived at the court where Anthony was detained. The doors, guarded by armed soldiers, were a physical and symbolic barrier between the people and the justice they sought. But the crowd didn't let themselves down. They clustered before the building, their voices growing in intensity, turning the air into a sea of cry and hope. The soldiers, trained not to feel, could not ignore the passion emanating from the crowd. Some hesitated, their hands shaking under the weight of the weapons. The morality of the situation weighed on them as a shadow, and in his eyes, a spark of doubt began to shine. Meanwhile, inside the court, Anthony could hear the turmoil. Every scream that penetrated the thick walls was a reminder that he was not alone, that his struggle was the struggle of many. In a moment of unbearable tension, something extraordinary happened. A group of protesters, led by Sarah, advanced towards the court doors. The soldiers, surprised by the unqualified determination of citizens, hesitated. The crowd, realizing the momentary weakness, pushed more strongly. It was like a powerful wave, overwhelming in its unity. The court doors, once an impenetrable fortress, began to give in under the pressure. And then, with a crash that echoed through the streets, they opened. The sound was like thunder, a prelude to a storm of change. A roar of victory erupted from the crowd, his voices united in an expression of triumph and hope. Inside the court, Anthony was brought to tears. The vision of his compatriots, risking everything for his freedom, was a testimony of human goodness and courage. He knew that, regardless of what happened next, a seed of change had been planted. The battle was far from over, but that day in Boston, something deep and transformative happened. The invisible currents of oppression began to weaken, and the flame of freedom, fed by the blood and sweat of many, shone more intensely than ever. Anthony Burns became not only a man in search of freedom, but a symbol of resistance that would inspire future generations to fight for a fairer world. And so, while the sun set itself over the city, dyeing the sky with shades in red and gold, the spirit of resistance remained unshakable. The struggle for freedom would continue, and Boston, with its historical streets and its fearless people, would be remembered as the stage of a lift that would echo through the ages, a proof that, when united, the power of the people can overcome any oppression. The air in Boston was saturated with the acre smell of gunpowder and blood, a mixture that penetrated the nostrils and clung to the skin as an indelible souvenir of the chaos that had settled. The city, once a mosaic of voices that cried for freedom, was now a battlefield marked by wreckage and despair. The sound of the shouts, the horses' hooves, and the swords' retirement echoed through the streets, announcing that the resistance had reached its brutal climax. Protesters, driven by a mixture of anger and hope, had become an unstoppable force, but repression soon came with all their cruelty. Soldiers and police, stiff by the duty and order to restore control, advanced against the crowd with violence that did not distinct. The dry crack of firearms, panic screams, and deaf bodies falling to the ground created a macabre symphony that reverberated around the city. Among the protesters, the faces of youth and old men and women were contoured by determination and fear. Sarah Turner, always on the front line, led her companions with a fervor that challenged her own death. His eyes, bright with passion and hatred for injustice, were headlights that guided those around him. But even his courage could not protect everyone. Beside her, friends fell, her bodies marked by the violence of confrontation, her lives torn by a law that refused to recognize her humanity. In the center of the storm, Anthony Burns, still a prisoner, heard the echoes of the battle outside. Each scream of pain reached his soul as a blade. Every lost life was an extra tribute in the struggle for his freedom. The weight of guilt and impotence crushed him, but at the same time, each sacrifice renewed his determination. He knew that the bloodshed in that battle would not be in vain, that the memory of those who fell would become a lighthouse for those who continued the fight. The clashes took epic proportions, turning the streets into a maze of blood and gunpowder. The injured, many of whom were innocent caught in crossfire, lay on the sidewalks, their pain moans mingling with chaos. Abolitionist volunteers ran through the turmoil, risking their lives to help the fallen, their faces masked by the determination of saving as much as possible, even when hope seemed scarce. The violence that was unleashed in Boston was not only a physical representation of the struggle, but a symbol of how willing the city was willing to sacrifice to challenge the yoke of injustice. Among the protesters, stories of bravery and sacrifice emerged as sparks in the dark. There were those who, even injured, refused to retreat, their bodies serving as human barriers against oppression. Others, taken by anger and pain, attacked with blind fury, their actions moved by the desperation of fighting for a future where they could finally be free. With the nightfall, the blood-stained streets have become silent terrain of mourning and reflection. Those who survived, they collected their dead and wounded, their trembling but firm hands in their convictions. The cost of resistance had proved high, but the flame of the revolution was not extinguished. The sacrifice of those who listed would not be forgotten, and their voices would join the symphony of a city that refused to be silenced. Within his cell, Anthony Burns felt the change in the air. Despite the pain and loss, the city of Boston had become a symbol of resistance, a living proof that the struggle for freedom, though arduous and painful, was a battle that was worth being fought. He knew that even if he did not see the dawn of his own freedom, his spirit of struggle would help to pave the way to those who would come after him. The city, wrapped in a mourning cloak and determination, was preparing for what would come next. Boston, with his ancient streets and his indomitable people, had become a moral battlefield, where justice and injustice crashed into a deadly dance. And while the dust of the battle slowly settled, the determination of those who fought remained unshakable, their voices united in a silent oath to continue the struggle until freedom was finally won. The resistance had not been in vain, and the spirit of Anthony Burns, though captive, remained free, guiding and inspiring all those who still dreamed of a world where justice prevailed over tyranny. The court doors opened, and a silent crowd gathered along the streets, their faces marked by expectation and pain. Anthony Burns's trial had become the epicenter of a moral battle that transcended the borders of Boston. The atmosphere was dense, loaded with the weight of imminent injustice, while Anthony, handcuffed and escorted by guards, made his way to where his destination would be sealed. Inside the court, the air was heavy with the smell of polished wood and nervous sweat. The sound of the chairs was echoing through the room as the viewers straightened, their fixed looks at Anthony, who sat with the haughty posture despite the circumstances. Anthony's eyes swept the room, briefly landing on the allied faces that had risked everything for him. Among them, Sarah Turner, with her chin erected in a silent challenge gesture, offered her an unshakable look. The judge, with his outdated wig and cold expression, watched the scene with a sharp indifference. For him and many others in positions of power, Anthony was not a man, but a symbol, a threat to the status quo that needed to be urgently silenced. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a voice dripping, stood up to speak, his presence dominating the room. He painted Anthony as a dangerous criminal, someone whose freedom posed a risk to the social order. Each word was stabbed in Anthony's heart, but he remained firm, his dignity intact. Anthony's defender, a young abolitionist lawyer named Richard Dana, then got up. With an eloquence fueled by passion and justice, he argued that Anthony was not a criminal, but a man seeking freedom, an inalienable right that should be guaranteed to all. His words resonated through the court, inflaming the spirit of those who still believed in court. However, the power of the law was against them, an oppressive machine that swallowed hopes and grinded dreams. Outside, the crowd waited, her murmurs of hope and frustration growing in intensity. Anthony's trial had become an inflection point, an event that mobilized not only Boston, but the whole country. Posters and pamphlets denounced the injustice of the process, while inflamed speeches were uttered on the corners and squares. Abolitionists saw in Anthony a martyr whose sacrifices could light the flames of the revolution. As the trial unfolded, the days became a slow and agonizing torture. The court was surrounded by a sea of anxious faces, all waiting for the verdict who would decide Anthony's fate. The tension was palpable. A string is about to break. Inside the cell, Anthony spent the nights in vigil. His thoughts turned to the faces of those who fought by his side. His hopes and dreams curl into his heart. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The court was packed, the heavy air with the smell of accumulated emotional gunpowder. When the judge read the sentence, a deadly silence fell over the room. Anthony Burns would be returned south, sentenced to return to the nightmare from which he had fled. The decision was like a dagger dug into the soul of the nation, an act that shook the foundations of morality and justice. Outside, the news spread like fire in dry grass. The previously contained crowd exploded in a cry of indignation and despair. The streets of Boston have become a chaos of furious voices and bitter tears. Anthony Burns's name was sung as a war cry, a call to weapons for all those who could no longer endure the tyranny of oppression. Inside the bus that would take him back to the South, Anthony sat silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Around them, the guards kept a watchful surveillance, their expressions hardened by the responsibility to comply with the law. But inside Anthony's chest, the resistance flame burned with an intensity that not even the chains could erase. He knew that his struggle did not end there, that his sacrifice would be the fuel for the flame of freedom that was beginning to illuminate the nation. As the vehicle moved away from the streets of Boston, Anthony looked back one last time, his heavy heart with the pain of separation, but firm in the conviction that his story would not end there. He was more than a man in search of freedom. It was a symbol of resistance, a lighthouse for all those who dared to dream of a world where justice prevailed over tyranny. And even as the sound of the wheels mingled with the distant echo of the protests, Anthony Burns knew that his fight was the struggle of many, and that one day his chains would be broken forever. The smell of gunpowder and sweat still hung in the air, like a persistent reminder of the battles fought on the streets of Boston. The city, now an icon of resistance, remained immersed in a dense atmosphere of mourning and determination. Anthony Burns, with his indomitable spirit and history of courage, had become a symbol of a much larger struggle than himself. His judgment and subsequent return to the South were not just a personal tragedy, but a catalyst for the fire of reforms that spread throughout the country. While the bus took him away, the echo of protests in Boston continued to reverberate throughout the north of the United States. The indignation caused by Anthony's case was like a spark that burned down a dry pard, feeding the abolitionist movement with a new intensity. The holdings in basements and the whispered conspiracies became public manifestations and powerful discourses that echoed in churches and squares. The voices that were once suffocated by oppression now shouted in unison by justice. Sarah Turner, tireless in her fight, became a recognized leader not only in Boston, but throughout the country. His determination to challenge injustice and fight for Anthony's freedom and all captured slaves was an inspiration to many. She stood out on makeshift stands, her clear and relentless voice cutting the air like a sharp blade, urging crowds to act. "Anthony Burns may have been taken, but her fight is our fight," she proclaimed, her eyes shining with the flame of the revolution. The impact of Anthony's case was not limited to inflamed speeches. He encouraged a new era of direct and clandestine action. The secret railway network, which had already helped so many freedom, expanded further, connecting new allies and safe ways to those who dared to escape from servitude. Previously silent houses became sacred shelters for fugitives, and solidarity among abolitionists grew day after day. The stories of courage and sacrifice multiplied, becoming live legends that kept the flame of hope lit. Abolitionist newspapers, such as William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator and Frederick Douglass's North Star, amplified Anthony's voice, turning their history into a call to action. The pages were full of detailed reports of the trial, the demonstrations, and the heroism of those involved. Each edition aroused the consciousness of thousands, leading the resistance message to the previously forgotten corners of the nation. Anthony Burns involuntarily became a martyr, whose influence resounded on each printed word. Meanwhile, in cities and villages along the North, abolitionist groups gathered to discuss bolder strategies. The idea that peaceful resistance was no longer enough began to gain strength. With each meeting, new plans were drawn, new alliances were forged, and the determination of overthrowing the slave system grew. The tension between the North and South intensified, and the nation seemed inexorably walking toward an inevitable confrontation. The story of Anthony Burns, though tragic, had aroused a collective conscience that could not be ignored. He had become a headlight that illuminated the way to a future where freedom would not be just a dream, but a reality for everyone. The conversations in the taverns, the sermons in the pulpits, and the heated debates in the squares were now permeated by one certainty. The time of slavery was told. In the heart of all this agitation, Anthony, still in captivity, remained a figure of strength and hope. His struggle, though personal, had become a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny. The echoes of his courage reverberated through the generations, inspiring many to continue the struggle he had begun. Even in the depths of oppression, the certainty that his story would not be forgotten gave him strength. And so, while the northern United States came together around the cry of freedom, Anthony Burns, the man whose history catalyzed a revolution, remained a living proof that the struggle for justice and equality was worth each sacrifice. The abolitionist movement, now more vigorous than ever, marched toward a future where the currents of oppression would finally be broken, and the light of freedom would shine to everyone. Boston, 1854. The air was impregnated with the pungent smell of burnt charcoal, a trace of the factories that pulsed the frantic rhythm of a boiling city. Fog hovered low, wrapping the streets in a cloak of mystery, while the shadows danced under the trembling light of the lamps. It was as if the city itself was breathing, absorbing every sigh of resistance and hope emanating from its inhabitants. Anthony Burns, a name that could once have gone unnoticed, now resonated around every corner, in every clandestine meeting, in every heart that longed for justice. Anthony Burns's capture and subsequent judgment had lit an inextinguishable flame in Boston and beyond. He had become an involuntary icon of a major cause than his own existence, a symbol of resistance that transcended the barriers of time and space. The voices that cried for their freedom had become a unified cry of revolt against the hateful slave system. In muffled taverns and darkness, stories of their courage were told and retrained, each infusing new life to the abolitionist movement. The streets of Boston, who witnessed the uprising for his liberation, were now the scene of a silent but powerful revolution. The abolitionists, inflamed by Anthony's sacrifice, intensified their efforts, joining forces in an increasingly intricate and extensive network. The secret rail trails of the Underground Railroad expanded, serpenting through states and cities, offering a path of hope to those who were still chained. Each household, each passing season, was a testimony of the indomitable determination of a people who refused to close their eyes to injustice. Sarah Turner, whose unshakable passion became a guidelight for many, continued her tireless crusade. His voice echoed at the meetings. His presence was a constant memory that the fight was far from over. "Anthony Burns showed us the way," she said, with the firmness of someone who knew the value of freedom. "We will not rest until all the shackles are broken." Their fervor and determination were contagious, inspiring others to join the cause, to rise against oppression, to become part of the history under construction. Abolitionist publications multiplied, each of them a silent cry of justice. The reports of Anthony's trial, the vivid descriptions of the manifestations, and the courage of those who dare challenged power echoed on the pages of the newspapers, reaching readers across the country. The printed words became powerful weapons, capable of inciting action, inspiring change, uniting those who could otherwise have remained silent. Meanwhile, in villages and cities throughout the North, the seeds of the revolution germinated. New leaders emerged, new strategies were elaborated, and the determination to end slavery gained strength every day. The story of Anthony Burns, with his sacrifice and courage, galvanized a generation that was now preparing to face the system with a renewed ferocity. Even in captivity, Anthony remained a figure of hope. His resistance, his dignity in the face of adversity, were headlights that guided those who fought for a better world. He had become a living legend, a martyr whose sacrifice would not be in vain. Each broken shot, every successful escape, every voice that rose in protest was a tribute to its struggle, its inflexible will of freedom. Boston's legacy in 1854 was not just a chapter in American history, it was a point of inflection, a collective awakening that would reverberate through the ages. Anthony Burns, the man whose capture and judgment set fire to a city, had become an eternal symbol of resistance and hope. His actions, his words, his indomitable spirit would continue to inspire generations to fight for justice and equality. And so, while the people of Boston looked into the future, their voices united in a promise of change, Anthony Burns, though physically distant, remained present in every heart that longed for freedom. He was a living testimony that the struggle for justice is never in vain, that resistance, even in the darker circumstances, can illuminate the way to a better world. Anthony Burns, a name recorded in the memory of the struggle against slavery, would continue to guide the footsteps of those who refused to accept tyranny. The currents that once arrested him now were a symbol of everything he had achieved, a reminder that freedom, once dreamed, can never be truly erased.